The golden shears glinted in the chandelier's light cold against her neck. Queen Beatrice didn't cry when her husband, the vampire king, grabbed her prized floor-length silver hair. She didn't flinch when the cruel laughter of his impossibly slender mistress echoed through the grand hall. He thought he was merely stripping his obese, heavily mocked wife of her last shred of beauty to appease his lover. He didn't know that those locks were the only seal holding back an apocalyptic curse. By midnight he would beg for her mercy. The aristocratic vampire courts of Europe had always been defined by a razor-sharp aesthetic. Within the shadowed velvet-draped halls of the Kensington estate, the epicenter of the British supernatural elite beauty was weaponized. Vampires were predators, and predators were supposed to be lean, gaunt, and flawlessly sculpted. To be a creature of the night was to be frozen in an eternal state of predatory perfection. And then there was Queen Beatrice. Beatrice was by every standard of the immortal high society glaringly and unapologetically fat. She weighed over 300 pounds, her body a landscape of soft, heavy curves that spilled over the edges of the rigid corsets the royal tailors forced upon her. Where the other noble women possessed hollowed cheekbones and waistlines you could encircle with two hands, Beatrice had a double chin, thick dimpled arms, and a stomach that pressed prominently against the rich silks of her gowns. Her physical presence was a monumental anomaly in a society of living statues. She was the daughter of the ancient Ashford line, a bloodline so old that even the Rothschild vampires and the covert Astor immortal syndicates owed them massive unpayable debts. That was the only reason King Alistair had married her. It was the Windsor Treaty of 1892, a binding magical contract that secured Alistair's dominion over the Western European territories, sealed only by his union with the last Ashford heir. Alistair was everything a vampire king was expected to be. He was devastatingly handsome, with features carved from marble eyes the color of bruised violets, and a physique honed by centuries of warfare and privilege. He moved with a liquid, terrifying grace. Beside him, Beatrice felt like a lumbering beast. Her heavy footsteps echoed down the marble corridors, a sound that was frequently followed by the cruel, barely concealed snickers of the courtiers. The glutton queen, they whispered behind their feathered fans. Alistair's heavy burden. Tonight was the annual Blood Moon Gala, an event covered covertly by the elite underground supernatural tabloids. Beatrice sat in her gilded throne at the head of the ballroom, her breathing shallow due to the agonizingly tight emerald bodice she wore. She was sweating slightly, her flushed, rounded face entirely at odds with the pale, aristocratic perfection around her. She watched with a heavy heart as her husband danced not with her but with Camille. Camille St. Clair was the king's mistress, an open secret that the entire court celebrated. Camille was a newly turned vampire, formerly a high-fashion model in the mortal realm, possessing a body so thin it bordered on skeletal. She was venomous sharp and entirely captivating. As she spun in Alistair's arms, her slender hips pressed intimately against his, her wicked laughter ringing out like a crystal bell over the classical string quartet. Beatrice averted her eyes, looking down at her own thick, swollen fingers resting on her lap. The only feature she possessed that the court could not mock was her hair. It was legendary, uncut. Since the day of her transformation 3 centuries ago, Beatrice's hair was a shimmering cascade of spun silver that trailed past her feet and pooled on the floor like liquid moonlight. It glowed with a faint, ethereal luminescence, soft to the touch and unnaturally strong. It was her singular vanity, a protective veil she often used to hide her rounded shoulders and plump cheeks from the glaring eyes of the aristocracy. "She looks like a frosted pastry left out in the sun," a voice murmured nearby. Beatrice didn't need to look up to know it was Lord Harrington, a sycophant who spent his immortal life vying for Alistair's favor. "It's a tragedy," Lady Genevieve replied, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Alistair is starved for elegance. Can you blame him for keeping Camille so close? Look at the sheer volume of the queen. I am surprised the throne's legs haven't splintered." Beatrice swallowed the lump in her throat, taking a slow sip from her crystal goblet of warm O-negative. She had endured this humiliation for decades. She had conditioned herself to absorb the cruelty, internalizing the shame of her size. What none of them knew, what even Alistair didn't understand, was the true nature of the Ashford bloodline. Her immense size was not born of gluttony. Immortals did not gain weight from overeating. Their bodies were frozen at the moment of their turning. Beatrice had been turned millennia ago, and her body was dynamically adapting. The Ashford line possessed a terrifying raw reservoir of ancient primordial magic. It was a magic so dense, so violently powerful, that a slender frame simply could not contain it without tearing itself apart. Her physical mass, her heavy fat, was the biological anchor, the required density to house an apocalyptic level of power without detonating. And her silver hair was the conduit, the magical grounding wire that bled off the excess energy, keeping the terrifying power dormant and stable. But as the music swelled, and Alistair leaned down to kiss Camille's pale, slender neck in front of the entire assembly, Beatrice felt the ancient heavy magic deep within her fat cells twitch with a dark, furious resentment. The gala transitioned to the private drawing rooms just before midnight. Only the highest-ranking aristocrats, the inner circle of the empire, were permitted entry. Beatrice had retreated to a velvet love seat in the corner, her large body sinking deeply into the cushions. She desperately wanted to retire to her chamber, to strip off the suffocating corset and let her massive silver hair cloak her entirely, but leaving before the king was considered high treason against the social order. Camille was holding court by the grand fireplace, a glass of blood wine dangling from her impossibly thin fingers. She looked flawless in a backless crimson gown that clung to her emaciated, elegant frame. But as she glanced over at Beatrice, her dark eyes narrowed. Camille had everything. She had the king's bed, the court's adoration, and the political power of a queen in all but name. Yet she was plagued by a singular burning jealousy. During a skirmish with a rogue werewolf pack 2 months prior, Camille's own hair had been singed by silver fire. It had grown back brittle, ashen, and stubbornly short. Every time she looked at the breathtaking, luminescent ocean of silver hair pooling around Beatrice's heavy frame, it drove her mad. "Alistair, darling," Camille purred, her voice carrying easily across the silent room. The conversations of the courtiers instantly died down. Everyone turned to watch the mistress address the king. Alistair, leaning against the mantel, smiled indulgently at her. "Yes, my love. I am cold," Camille pouted, stepping closer to him and running a delicate finger down his chest. "And I feel so entirely unadorned. I have an upcoming photo shoot for Vogue Haute Couture's underground edition, and my hair is simply atrocious. It lacks magic. I shall have the royal weavers spin you a wig of the finest nocturnal silks," Alistair promised, kissing her forehead. Camille pulled away, a cruel, calculating smile playing on her lips. She turned her gaze directly upon Beatrice. "Silk is so common. I want something rarer, something real. The queen has far more hair than she needs. In fact, on such a massive canvas, all that hair simply looks disproportionate, a waste of aesthetic potential." The room went dead silent. Even the sadistic courtiers held their breath. Beatrice's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a heavy, thudding rhythm. She clutched the folds of her green dress, her thick fingers trembling. "No!" She whispered the word, barely escaping her lips. Alistair's violet eyes shifted to his wife. His expression, so warm and indulgent with Camille, instantly froze into an icy mask of disdain. He looked at Beatrice's rounded, terrified face, her double chin quivering, her broad shoulders hunched defensively. To him she was an embarrassment, a political necessity he was forced to endure. Camille's request presented an opportunity to assert his dominance and please his true love. "It is a brilliant idea," Alistair said smoothly, pushing himself off the mantel. "Alistair, please," Beatrice gasped, struggling to push her heavy body up from the low sofa. Her knees ached under the weight as she stood, her silver hair cascading around her in a protective fortress of light. "You cannot. It is not just hair. It is mine. It is the only thing I have. You have the title of Queen Beatrice, a title your grotesque physical form does not warrant," Alistair said, his voice echoing with brutal clarity in the quiet room. He walked slowly toward her, pulling a pair of golden ceremonial shears from a decorative display on the wall. "Do not be selfish. You are already an eyesore to my court. The least you can do is offer your one redeeming feature to someone who can actually make use of its beauty." "No." Beatrice took a heavy, desperate step backward. "Alistair, I am warning you. You do not understand the Ashford biology. You do not understand what the hair does. Silence your pathetic whining." Alistair snarled, his patience snapping. In a blur of vampiric speed, he crossed the room. Before Beatrice could even scream, Alistair's hand clamped down on the back of her neck. His grip was like a steel vice. Because of her heavy weight and lack of physical combat training, Beatrice stood no chance against his predatory strength. He forced her down to her knees. The impact sent a painful shudder through her heavy thighs and sent the emerald silk of her dress tearing at the seams. "Hold still, you fat cow," he hissed quietly in her ear, masking his vulgarity from the court. "Alistair, stop, please." Tears streamed down Beatrice's plump cheeks, ruining her powdered makeup. She thrashed her thick arms, trying to push him away, but he was immovable. Camille stepped forward, her eyes wide with sadistic glee. "Take it from the nape, darling. I want the full length." Alistair grabbed a massive, thick handful of the luminescent silver hair. Beatrice let out a gut-wrenching sob, her large body trembling violently on the floor. Snip! The sound of the golden shears slicing through the enchanted locks was deafeningly loud in the silent room. Snip! 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 It took several forceful cuts, the shears grinding against the unnaturally strong strands. With one final brutal tug, Alistair severed the tether. Beatrice collapsed forward onto her hands, gasping for air. Her head felt horrifyingly light. The magnificent curtain of silver that had shielded her for centuries was gone, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and brutally shorn. The hair remaining on her head was chopped unevenly at her jawline, a jagged, humiliating mess that only accentuated the roundness of her face and the thickness of her neck. Alistair stood up, holding the massive, glowing bundle of 300-year-old silver hair like a hunting trophy. He walked over to Camille and draped it over her slender arms. "For you, my queen of the night," he murmured. Camille buried her face in the glowing locks, laughing delightedly. The courtiers erupted into polite, sycophantic applause, clapping for the king's generosity. No one looked at the obese queen weeping on the floor. No one noticed the way the severed ends of her remaining hair began to sizzle with pitch-black energy. No one noticed that the very air around Beatrice's heavy, kneeling form was beginning to warp and bend the floorboards, groaning under a sudden, impossible increase in gravity. Humiliated beyond words, her dress torn, and her spirit shattered, Beatrice dragged her heavy body up from the floor. She did not look at Alistair. She did not look at Camille. She kept her head down her jagged, ruined hair, failing to hide her tear-stained, flushed cheeks, and she fled. Her heavy footsteps echoed erratically as she ran up the grand marble staircase to the royal wing. Her lungs burned, and her thick thighs chafed against the restrictive undergarments. Every step felt heavier than the last, but not just because of her weight. Something was fundamentally wrong. By the time she reached her massive oak bedroom doors, she felt like she was dragging the entire planet behind her. She pushed into her chambers, slamming the doors shut and collapsing onto the plush carpet. She clutched her chest, gasping for air. Deep within her cellular structure, the ancient Ashford magic was screaming. For 3 centuries, the magic had been flowing out of her through the conductive silver hair, radiating safely into the atmosphere. Now the valve was welded shut. The raw, cataclysmic energy had nowhere to go. It began to bounce back, violently rebounding through her nervous system, flooding the dense, heavy fat cells that made up her formidable mass. Her body was doing exactly what it was genetically engineered to do. It was absorbing the magic, converting it into kinetic and gravitational power. Her fat was no longer just biological tissue. It was becoming highly condensed, dark matter. Down in the king's chambers, Alistair poured 2 glasses of aged mortal blood, handing one to Camille. The mistress was sitting at the vanity, already having the royal stylists weave the luminescent silver locks into a stunning floor-length wig. "She looked like a butchered pig on the floor," Camille giggled, taking a sip of the rich blood. "You were magnificent, Alistair. Truly terrifying." Alistair smirked, unbuttoning his tailored waistcoat. "She has been an embarrassment for far too long. Perhaps this humiliation will finally encourage her to petition the Immortal Council for an annulment. I would gladly surrender the Ashford Alliance if it meant I never had to look at her waddling down my halls again." The grandfather clock in the corner of the room began to chime. Dong, 11:59. Dong, midnight. On the 3rd chime, the glass of blood in Camille's hand shattered into 1,000 pieces. The crimson liquid didn't fall to the floor. It hung suspended in mid-air, trembling. "What in the—" Alistair stepped forward, but before he could finish his sentence, the gravity in the room violently inverted, then slammed back down with 10 times its normal force. Alistair, a vampire king with the strength to lift a freight train, was instantly smashed to his knees. The marble floor cracked beneath him. Camille screamed as she was dragged from her vanity chair, slamming face first onto the ground. The immense pressure pinned her skeletal frame to the floorboards. "Alistair, Alistair, I can't breathe," she shrieked, her ribcage audibly groaning under the unseen weight. It wasn't just their room. Across the sprawling Kensington estate, hundreds of elite vampires suddenly collapsed. In the grand ballroom, aristocrats who had been mocking the Queen moments ago were now glued to the floor, gasping like fish out of water, their incredibly dense, immortal bones cracking under the atmospheric pressure. Outside, the skies above London ripped open. A massive swirling vortex of pitch-black clouds and crimson lightning spiraled directly over the estate. Up in her chambers, Beatrice was no longer crying. She stood in the center of the room. The emerald corset had completely shredded, unable to contain her. She was immense, breathtaking, and terrifying. Her jagged short hair was now floating around her face, defying gravity, glowing with a dark violet radiation. Her soft, heavy curves were radiating a blinding, pulsing heat. Her eyes, once soft and timid, were now completely black, completely devoid of mercy. Her heavy mass was generating a localized gravitational field. The heavier she was, the more power she commanded. "He took my crown," Beatrice whispered, her voice layered with the echoing resonance of 1,000 ancient Ashford ancestors. She took a step toward the door. Boom! The entire estate shuddered. The walls cracked. Paintings fell. She took another step. Boom! Down below, Alistair lay pinned to the floor, blood trickling from his nose. His violet eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as he felt the crushing shockwaves vibrating through the ceiling above him. It was a heavy, booming footstep, a sound he had mocked for decades. Boom! The Queen was coming downstairs, and by midnight the entire empire realized that the woman they had starved of respect was about to feast on their terror. The grand staircase of the Kensington estate was an architectural marvel constructed from flawless, imported Italian marble and reinforced with enchanted dwarven-forged steel underneath the polished stone. It had withstood 3 centuries of reckless vampire revelry, easily surviving covert bomb blasts during the Blitz and the wildly violent skirmishes of the Victorian blood feuds. Yet as Queen Beatrice placed her bare, heavy foot upon the top step, a jagged, terrifying fissure instantly splintered down the center of the pristine white marble. The sound was like a glacier violently cracking in the dead of winter. Beatrice paused, her chest heaving, the remnants of her shredded emerald corset hanging loosely around her monumental waist. She looked down at her thick, dimpled arms, watching in absolute awe as the flesh seemed to ripple with a terrible, localized distortion of light. The ancient Ashford magic denied its exit through her severed silver hair, was violently compounding within her dense adipose tissue. Her immense weight, which had been the singular subject of endless, cruel mockery among the gaunt and hollow-cheeked aristocracy, was undergoing a terrifying alchemical transformation. Her fat cells were no longer merely storing biological energy, they were actively converting into ultra-dense primordial dark matter. She was becoming a living, breathing singularity, and her mass was the undeniable anchor holding the catastrophic power together. She took another step downward. Boom! The entire western wing of the estate violently groaned. The crystal chandeliers hanging in the grand foyer violently swung their diamond-cut droplets, shattering against one another in a chaotic, chiming frenzy. Down in the main ballroom, the scene was one of unadulterated, humiliating panic. The elite supernatural lords and ladies of the empire, creatures who had spent centuries cultivating an aura of untouchable, predatory grace, were now indiscriminately pinned to the beautifully polished hardwood floor. The gravitational field expanding outward from Beatrice's heavy form was absolute and entirely unforgiving. Lord Harrington, the sycophant, who had dared to compare her to a frosted pastry, was currently plastered flat against the base of a marble pillar. His impeccably tailored tuxedo was ripping at the seams as the invisible, crushing weight pressed his hollow skeletal chest relentlessly downward. He opened his mouth to scream, but the air was forcibly expelled from his collapsed lungs, leaving him gasping like a stranded, suffocating fish. Nearby, Lady Genevieve, who had so gleefully insulted the queen's monumental size, was wedged agonizingly against the shattered remains of a banquet table. Her delicate porcelain pale face was pressed mercilessly into a puddle of spilled crimson blood wine, her flawless makeup entirely ruined as the immense atmospheric pressure threatened to snap her fragile immortal spine. "What is happening?" choked a prominent representative of the Romanov Syndicate, a ruthless Russian vampire faction known for their unyielding fortitude. He was currently dragging his body across the floor by his fingernails, his incredibly dense muscles tearing under the sheer impossible strain of the localized gravity. "The wards, who has breached the defensive wards?" But there was no external breach. The destruction was entirely domestic, born of the woman they had systematically starved of respect. Beatrice continued her descent, her heavy, measured footsteps acting as the relentless drumbeat of an impending apocalypse. Boom! Boom! With every downward stride, the ambient temperature in the foyer violently plummeted, frosting the elaborate mirrors and freezing the blood in the discarded goblets. Yet Beatrice herself radiated a blinding, terrifying heat. Her jagged, unevenly chopped silver hair floated fiercely around her plump, flushed face, completely defying the very gravity she was generating. Her dark, pitch-black eyes swept over the groveling, immobilized aristocracy below. For the first time in her 300-year existence, Beatrice did not feel the desperate, clawing need to shrink herself. She did not wish to hide her broad, heavy shoulders, nor did she feel the familiar, burning shame regarding the thick, soft prominence of her stomach. The profound, undeniable truth of the Ashford bloodline finally settled over her like a heavy, magnificent mantle. Her body was a fortress. Her monumental size was not a flaw, a genetic failure, or a grotesque anomaly to be hidden behind corsets and spun silver. Her tremendous, unapologetic fatness was an absolute biological necessity, a brilliantly designed biological vessel engineered specifically to house a power that would absolutely obliterate a slender, conventionally attractive frame. The gaunt, skeletal vampires groveling on the floor below her would instantly vaporize if they possessed even a fraction of the raw, violent energy currently coursing through her heavy, dimpled thighs. She reached the bottom of the staircase. The polished floorboards immediately buckled and warped violently beneath her bare feet, forming a shallow, spider-webbed crater as she stood. She looked down at the immobilized, terrified faces of the High Court, the Morgans, the covert De Beers cartel representatives, the ancient European blood barons. All of them were trapped, utterly humiliated, pressed into the dirt by the sheer, undeniable magnitude of her existence. "You worshipped at the altar of the slender, the hollow, and the starved." Beatrice's voice resonated not just from her throat, but echoing directly from the vibrating walls and the cracking foundation of the estate itself. The sound was layered, heavy, and dripping with 3 centuries of suppressed, agonizing rage. "You looked at a mountain and mocked it for not being a brittle, fragile twig. You thought my weight was a heavy burden to the king." She offered a slow, terrifying smile that did not reach her pitch-black eyes. "My weight is the only thing keeping this entire continent from tearing itself apart." She turned her broad, imposing back on the whimpering, crushed courtiers and slowly, methodically began to walk down the shadowed, velvet-lined corridor that led directly to the king's private master chambers. She dragged her heavy hand along the flocked wallpaper as she moved, and wherever her thick fingertips made contact, the wall violently disintegrated into a shower of fine, powdery dust. The air around her violently hummed, thick and heavy with the scent of ozone, burning velvet, and unbridled, devastating vengeance. Inside the king's opulent, fiercely guarded master suite, the situation had rapidly devolved into a chaotic, terrifying nightmare. The room, decorated with priceless, imported Renaissance tapestries and heavily gilded antique furniture, was being systemically crushed by an unseen, merciless force. King Alistair, a ruler whose martial prowess and terrifying speed had conquered vast swathes of the underground European supernatural territories, was currently on his hands and knees, desperately trying to push himself up from the heavily splintering floorboards. Blood, thick and unnaturally dark, was slowly weeping from his tear ducts and his perfectly sculpted nose. His violet eyes were wide with a frantic, uncomprehending panic. His dense, Immortal muscles bulged and strained against his tailored shirt, popping the expensive buttons, but he could not rise. It felt as though a massive, invisible skyscraper had been unceremoniously dropped directly upon his broad shoulders. A few feet away, near the shattered remains of the antique vanity, Camille was continuously shrieking in a high, piercing pitch of pure, unadulterated agony. The localized gravity was severely punishing her ultra-thin skeletal frame, but that was not the primary source of her horrific torment. The magnificent, glowing wig of silver hair, woven frantically by the royal stylists mere moments ago from Beatrice's brutally severed locks, was actively rejecting her. Without the massive, dense, biological anchor of Beatrice's heavy, fat body to continuously ground and stabilize the immense magical current, the severed silver hair had become an unstable, wildly volatile battery. As it sat securely pinned to Camille's head, the luminescent strands began to glow with a blinding, searing violet intensity. The magic was desperately trying to discharge, to find a heavy mass, to earth its catastrophic energy, and Camille's hollow, emaciated body was utterly insufficient. "Alistair, take it off, take it off. It is burning me," Camille screamed frantically, violently clawing at her own scalp. Her elegant, manicured fingers blistered and violently popped the moment they made contact with the glowing silver strands. The hair had magically fused itself to her skull, acting as a corrosive, acidic crown. The scent of searing flesh and burning hair rapidly filled the stifling, heavy air of the master suite. Alistair tried to crawl toward his screaming mistress, gritting his perfectly white teeth against the monstrous, crushing gravitational pressure. "Camille, hold on! I command!" He wheezed, his voice pathetic and weak, entirely devoid of its usual regal, imposing thunder. The heavy mahogany double doors of the master suite did not simply open, they violently exploded inward, blasting off their heavily reinforced iron hinges and splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces of deadly shrapnel. Through the settling cloud of dust and debris stepped Queen Beatrice. She was a breathtaking vision of unyielding, terrifying destruction. Her ripped, ruined dress clung desperately to her massive, heavy curves. The jagged, chaotic ends of her remaining silver hair wildly whipped around her round, flushed face like a crown of dark, violent lightning. The sheer, overwhelming physical mass of her body commanded the absolute entirety of the room. She was entirely unapologetic, dominating the space not with predatory speed or slender grace, but with the raw, immovable, devastating power of a celestial body. Alistair stared up at his obese wife, his mind violently fracturing as he desperately tried to comprehend the absolute impossibility of the situation before him. "Beatrice!" He choked out, coughing up a spatter of dark blood onto his ruined, expensive waistcoat. What dark sorcery have you unleashed? Stop this instantly, I am your king. I command you to cease." Beatrice did not run. She did not blur with vampiric speed. She simply walked toward him, her heavy, deliberate footsteps shaking the very foundation of the estate. She stopped inches from his prone, groveling form, her thick thighs acting as a terrifying, immovable wall before him. She looked down at his perfectly sculpted, agonizingly handsome face, a face she had spent 3 centuries hopelessly adoring, a face that had ordered her brutal, humiliating mutilation merely to please a hollow, cruel mistress. "You do not command gravity, Alistair," Beatrice said softly, her voice an incredibly heavy, dark velvet that sent violent shivers directly down his immobilized spine. "And you most certainly do not command me. Not anymore." She slowly crouched down, her heavy knees popping slightly, her massive presence fully enveloping his field of vision. She reached out with one thick, plump hand and gently, almost mockingly, traced the sharp, terrified line of his aristocratic jaw. He violently flinched, not just from the gesture, but from the blinding, searing heat aggressively radiating from her soft, dimpled skin. "You thought my size was a tragic flaw, a pathetic overindulgence?" Beatrice whispered, leaning in closer, her pitch-black eyes locking relentlessly onto his terrified violet ones. "You thought you were enduring my grotesque physical presence out of sheer political necessity. But you entirely fail to understand the basic mechanics of power. A slender cup cannot possibly hold an ocean, Alistair. Your fragile, Beautiful Camille is breaking under a mere fraction of the power I comfortably carry every single day. Right on cue, a horrific, gurgling scream erupted from the corner of the room. Camille was violently thrashing on the splintered floorboards, her back arched at an impossible, unnatural angle. The silver wig had reached critical mass. The luminescent strands were violently melting into her flesh, forcefully injecting the raw, highly unstable Ashford magic directly into her fragile, hollow veins. Because she lacked the necessary protective density of massive fat reserves to absorb and safely cushion the catastrophic magical blow, her thin, delicate circulatory system was quite literally boiling from the inside out. Alistair weakly turned his head, watching in absolute paralyzed horror as his beloved mistress convulsed one final violent time before forcefully collapsing into a smoking, unconscious, heavily blistered heap upon the ruined carpet. "Camille!" Alistair rasped, a single pathetic tear mixing with the blood currently streaming down his pale, bruised cheek. Beatrice stood back up, her heavy body blocking his view of the ruined, smoking mistress. She looked down at the king of the Western Empire, a man who had viciously stripped her of her dignity in front of the entire elite aristocracy, entirely unaware that he was eagerly pulling the pin from a catastrophic grenade. "She wanted my hair," Beatrice stated coldly, her heavy arms crossing defiantly over her prominent stomach. "She has it. I hope it brings her exactly the aesthetic perfection she so desperately craved." Alistair looked back up at his wife. For the absolute first time in his long, privileged, immortal life, he did not see a lumbering, embarrassing burden. He did not see a pathetic, gluttonous queen to be mocked behind heavily feathered fans. He saw a terrifying, unconquerable goddess of raw, primordial destruction. He saw the genuine, unadulterated apex of the predatory food chain, and she was immensely, undeniably fat. What are you going to do to me?" Alistair whispered, his voice violently trembling with entirely unfamiliar, genuine fear. The localized gravity was actively crushing his ribs, making every single breath an agonizing, desperate struggle for mere survival. Beatrice looked around the ruined, spectacularly destroyed master bedroom. She looked at the deeply fractured, groaning walls, the aggressively shattered antique windows, and the helplessly immobilized, entirely subjugated king groveling pathetically at her bare, heavy feet. The empire that had spent centuries laughing relentlessly at her size was currently trembling entirely under its unbearable, crushing weight. "I am going to do exactly what I was genetically engineered to do, Alistair," Beatrice said, her dark, pitch-black eyes narrowing with cold, calculating, unyielding authority. "I am going to expand." The gravitational shockwave did not merely confine itself to the gilded, heavily reinforced walls of the Kensington estate. As Queen Beatrice made her declaration, the localized dark matter compounding within her dense, magnificent adipose tissue sent a terrifying, rippling, seismic anomaly straight through the ancient bedrock of London. Mortal seismologists stationed at the British Geological Survey in Keyworth stared at their monitors in absolute bewildered horror. The needle of the Richter scale violently danced, registering a localized earthquake that completely defied natural tectonic plate logic. It was an impossible, highly concentrated tremor that subtly rattled the steel foundations of the shard and sent mild, unexplained vibrations echoing through the highly secure subterranean bunkers of MI5 headquarters along the River Thames. The mortal world remained entirely oblivious to the supernatural apocalypse, unfolding beneath the veneer of an unseasonable midnight storm. They blamed the sudden drop in barometric pressure on rogue weather patterns coming off the North Sea. They had absolutely no idea that the atmospheric crushing weight was directly tethered to the emotional and physical liberation of a 300-pound immortal queen. Back within the spectacularly ruined master suite of the Kensington estate, King Alistair remained pinned helplessly to the violently splintered floorboards, the immense crushing pressure radiating from his heavily dimpled, immensely powerful wife made drawing a single ragged breath feel like inhaling crushed glass. Beatrice did not grant him the swift, merciful release of death. Death was far too simple a cowardly escape for a monarch who had spent 3 centuries institutionalizing cruelty. Instead, Beatrice simply turned her broad, formidable back on him, leaving the vampire king to grovel in the dust alongside the smoking, blistered, unconscious ruin of his beloved mistress Camille. Beatrice moved with a heavy rhythmic majesty, her bare feet stepping effortlessly over the shattered debris of the master suite. She walked back out into the expansive, velvet-lined corridors of the royal wing. The estate was terrifyingly silent, save for the agonizing, muffled groans of the elite aristocracy currently trapped, pinned relentlessly to the floors across the entire property. The ambient, magical energy of the Kensington estate, the ancient, invisible ley lines that had powered the vampire courts for generations, was actively responding to her immense physical mass. She was drawing the magic into herself. As Beatrice walked heavily down the hall, the magical wards protecting the estate began to visibly dismantle, unraveling like a cheap frayed tapestry. The glowing ethereal runes carved into the mahogany doors and the imported marble pillars flickered out, their ancient power forcibly vacuumed into the dense dark matter matrix of her heavy fat cells. She was physically absorbing the defensive infrastructure of the entire vampire empire. Down in the underground catacombs beneath the estate, the situation was equally catastrophic. The ancestral crypts, heavily guarded by ancient sentinels and warded by blood magic established during the clandestine Windsor Treaty of 1892, began to aggressively shake. The massive iron-wrought coffins containing the dormant elders of the European syndicates furiously rattled. The elders, ancient skeletal creatures who had slumbered since the Dark Ages, were being rudely, violently awakened by the suffocating heavy pressure of a gravitational anomaly they could not comprehend. Beatrice slowly descended the grand, spectacularly fractured marble staircase, her heavy thighs brushing against the ruined remnants of her emerald silk gown. She reached the grand ballroom where the cream of supernatural high society remained pressed agonizingly against the beautifully polished hardwood. They were no longer laughing. The cruel, sycophantic whispers, the mocking glances directed at her double chin and her broad, soft shoulders had been completely silenced by the undeniable, terrifying reality of her biological supremacy. She waded heavily into the sea of fallen, trembling aristocrats. She approached Lord Harrington, the gaunt, hollow-cheeked sycophant who had so eagerly compared her to a frosted pastry. He was currently weeping actual tears of blood, tracking through the expensive pale powder on his aristocratic face. "My queen!" Harrington choked out the immense pressure, threatening to snap his frail immortal collarbone. "Mercy! I beg of you, profound mercy!" Beatrice paused, her heavy shadow falling entirely over his trembling form. She looked down at him with pitch-black, merciless eyes. "Mercy is a luxury afforded to those who are fragile, Lord Harrington," she stated, her voice a heavy, echoing vibration that rattled the remaining glass in the shattered chandeliers. "For centuries, you have praised the fragile. You have worshipped the hollow, the skeletal, the starving. You built an entire societal hierarchy upon the desperate, pathetic need to take up as little space as possible." She slowly crouched down, her prominent stomach resting comfortably against her heavy, powerful thighs. The sheer, radiating heat of her localized gravity instantly scorched the expensive silk of Harrington's tuxedo. "I am taking up space now, Harrington. I am taking up all of it. And you will find that a kingdom built on starvation absolutely crumbles when faced with the undeniable, unstoppable force of genuine heavy abundance." She stood back up the floorboards, groaning violently under her formidable weight. Beatrice turned her attention toward the grand, heavily gilded double doors that led to the royal throne room. For centuries, she had sat on a smaller secondary throne beside Alistair, deliberately positioned slightly behind him, a visual, permanent reminder of her subservient, supposedly inferior status. She walked heavily toward the doors, the invisible, crushing wave of gravity effortlessly blasting the heavy oak panels off their iron hinges before she even made physical contact. The throne room was empty, save for the two magnificent towering chairs carved from pure blackened obsidian and draped in imported crimson velvet. Beatrice bypassed her secondary, smaller throne entirely. She walked deliberately toward the king's seat, the massive central throne of the Western Empire. She turned the jagged, chaotic remnants of her luminescent luminescent silver hair floating wildly around her fiercely flushed, beautifully round face, and she sat down. The obsidian throne forged to withstand the terrifying strength of a vampire warlord loudly cracked. A deep, jagged fissure aggressively splintered down the center of the heavy black stone as it struggled to accommodate the incredible, ultra-dense dark matter currently contained within her 300-pound frame. But the throne held, it groaned, it fractured, but it ultimately accepted the monumental heavy burden of its true absolute ruler. Beatrice rested her thick, dimpled arms on the heavily gilded armrests. She took a slow, deep breath, her large, soft chest expanding. The gravitational field pulsating from her heavy body stabilized, locking the entire Kensington estate and every single immortal soul currently within its highly contested borders into a permanent, suffocating stasis. The era of the gaunt, the hollow, and the starved was officially permanently dead. The heavy reign of the glutton queen had officially, violently begun. The terrifying news of the catastrophic anomaly at the Kensington estate did not take long to spread. Supernatural intelligence networks operate far faster than mortal communication arrays. Within mere hours, the highly secretive Sanguine Directorate of Geneva, a clandestine coalition of the oldest, most ruthless vampire lords operating deep beneath the Swiss Alps, received the frantic, garbled distress signals. The Directorate, heavily backed by the ancient, incredibly wealthy Rothschild immortal syndicates and the shadowy occult divisions of the Vatican's secret archives, immediately convened an emergency high-stakes tribunal. They dispatched their most formidable, heavily armored enforcers, a highly trained cadre of elite skeletal assassins known as the Nightshades. These warriors were legendary for their blinding, impossible speed and their terrifying, gaunt physiques engineered to slip through the shadows completely undetected. They arrived at the heavily fractured wrought-iron gates of the Kensington estate just before dawn, expecting to find the aftermath of a rogue werewolf siege or a violently organized coup by a rival syndicate. Instead, they found an impenetrable, invisible wall of localized, crushing gravity. The moment the lead Nightshade assassin, a terrifyingly swift, hollow-eyed killer named Valerius, stepped across the estate's property line, his incredible, blinding momentum was instantly, violently halted. The heavy, suffocating atmospheric pressure slammed into his fragile skeletal frame like a runaway freight train. His ultra-dense immortal kneecaps instantaneously shattered with a loud, sickening crunch, and he was driven face first into the cobblestone driveway. The remaining assassins behind him fared no better, collapsing into a violently thrashing, heavily immobilized heap of specialized armor and broken, brittle bones. From the shattered window of the grand throne room, Queen Beatrice watched the pathetic, helpless display. She did not even need to lift a single thick finger to defend her violently claimed territory. Her sheer monumental existence was the absolute ultimate defense mechanism, her heavily compounded mass vibrating with the raw, unstable ancient magic of the Ashford bloodline essentially turned the entire grounds of the estate into a deadly, inescapable black hole. Inside the throne room, the situation had grown even more grim for the former king. Alistair had been violently dragged before the cracked obsidian throne by his own heavily oppressed, immobilized guards, who were forced to crawl on their hands and knees under the heavy, crushing weight of Beatrice's localized gravity. Alistair was a pathetic, broken ruin of his former incredibly handsome self. His expensive tailored clothes hung in bloody, shredded ribbons. His beautifully sculpted face was heavily bruised, heavily swollen, and streaked with thick, dark, dried blood. He was forcefully pinned to the marble floor, directly at the base of the fractured throne, staring up at the magnificent, heavily dimpled feet of the wife he had so cruelly, publicly mutilated. Beatrice, Alistair rasped, his voice trembling violently, heavily, laced with a desperate, pathetic mixture of genuine terror and complete, utter disbelief. The Directorate, they will not allow this. The Council will absolutely sanction a full, unyielding military strike against you. You cannot possibly hope to hold the entire empire hostage with this monstrous, unnatural magic. Beatrice shifted her heavy weight on the groaning obsidian throne, leaning forward slightly, her dark, pitch-black eyes bore directly into his fractured, terrified violet gaze. "You still do not fundamentally understand, Alistair," she murmured, her heavy, resonating voice echoing violently off the shattered crystal chandeliers. "This is not magic. This is pure, unadulterated biology. The Directorate is perfectly welcome to send their fastest, most exceptionally lethal assassins. They will merely break like fragile, brittle glass against the heavy, undeniable mountain of my existence." She slowly raised her thick, heavy hand, gesturing vaguely toward the heavily shadowed corner of the massive throne room. "Bring her to the light." Two heavily trembling, crawling guards slowly dragged a horrific, violently smoking bundle into the center of the room. It was Camille. The once incredibly slender, universally adored mistress was completely, utterly unrecognizable. The volatile, highly unstable, luminescent silver wig had permanently, horrifically fused to her skull, acting as a relentless, actively draining magical parasite. Because Camille's hollow, emaciated body possessed absolutely no dense fat reserves to safely absorb and cushion the catastrophic Ashford magic, the silver hair was continuously, violently burning her from the inside out. She was kept alive only by her incredibly stubborn, immortal, regenerative abilities, locked into a permanent, horrifying cycle of heavily blistered skin, desperately healing and instantaneously burning again. She was a withered, agonizingly twitching husk, softly whimpering as the glowing silver strands violently sapped the very last remaining drops of her stolen vitality. Alistair violently recoiled, squeezing his violet eyes shut against the horrific, stomach-churning sight of his brutally ruined lover. "Monster!" he hissed, tears violently tracking through the heavy blood on his cheeks. "You are a complete, unredeemable monster. I am precisely what you violently carved me into," Beatrice corrected smoothly, her broad, soft face a mask of absolute unyielding coldness. "I was perfectly content to remain the heavily mocked, fiercely quiet glutton queen. I was perfectly content to allow you to rule safely, venting my catastrophic, highly volatile power through the conductive silver hair you so deeply despised. You demanded aesthetic perfection, Alistair. You demanded a slender, hollow court. Now, you shall truly witness the heavy, devastating price of your profound, unforgivable vanity." Beatrice slowly stood up from the violently groaning throne. The localized gravity in the room exponentially doubled, pressing Alistair so incredibly hard against the marble floor that he felt his incredibly dense ribcage begin to heavily, ominously splinter. The Windsor Treaty of 1892 was absolutely never about securing territory, Alistair. Beatrice revealed, her heavy voice dripping with ancient, heavily suppressed secrets. The Vatican, the Rothschilds, they actively brokered the marriage because the Ashford bloodline was highly dangerous. My ancestors heavily relied on incredibly dense, highly massive physical forms to contain the apocalyptic energy. When the vampire high society aggressively pivoted toward an obsession with gaunt, slender aesthetics, the Ashford line became a massive, catastrophic liability. I was safely contained, firmly anchored by my heavy, deeply mocked fat and heavily grounded by my silver hair. You foolishly, arrogantly broke the ultimate seal. She walked heavily down the short steps of the dais, stopping directly in front of his violently trembling, heavily pinned form. "You are no longer a king," Beatrice decreed, her heavy, commanding voice sealing his permanent, absolute doom. "You are a heavily broken, entirely obsolete relic of a deeply fragile, incredibly pathetic era. You are officially stripped of all your heavy titles, completely severed from all your extensive syndicates, and permanently banished from the High Council. You shall remain heavily pinned to the floor of this throne room, exactly like a crushed, profoundly insignificant insect, until I finally decide the sheer heavy boredom of your pathetic existence outweighs the deep, satisfying amusement of your absolute, complete humiliation." Alistair opened his bloodied mouth to scream, to fiercely protest, but the heavy, merciless gravity forcefully slammed his jaw completely shut, violently snapping his perfectly white, heavily sharpened fangs. Beatrice turned her incredibly broad, powerful back heavily upon him. She walked deliberately toward the massive, heavily shattered window that looked completely out over the sprawling, terrifyingly silent grounds of the Kensington estate. The heavy, swirling, pitch-black storm clouds above London aggressively churned fiercely, reflecting the raw, incredible dark matter actively coursing through her heavy, magnificent veins. The entire incredibly vast vampire empire had spent 3 agonizing centuries cruelly forcing her to feel incredibly profoundly small. But as Queen Beatrice surveyed her newly violently conquered, heavily subjugated domain, she heavily rested her thick, dimpled hands upon her prominent, deeply powerful stomach and smiled. She would never ever shrink again. The heavy, undeniable gravity of her supreme reign had only just begun. The heavy, suffocating silence that blanketed the Kensington estate lasted for exactly 3 weeks. The mortal world, meticulously manipulated by the Hearst media conglomerate and covertly funded by the supernatural Arno luxury syndicate, was fed a carefully fabricated narrative. They broadcasted stories of a localized, highly toxic chemical spill in West London, successfully evacuating the surrounding mortal neighborhoods. The ignorant human populace remained completely oblivious to the terrifying reality. The actual hazard was a 300-pound immortal queen actively bending the space-time continuum from her fractured obsidian throne. Beyond the invisible, crushing gravitational barrier of the estate, the global supernatural economy was entirely collapsing. The sanguine directorate, severely humiliated by the instantaneous defeat of their nightshade assassins, was forced to accept a profoundly bitter truth. Queen Beatrice could not be assassinated. She could not be starved out. Her immensely heavy, perfectly adapted biology was actively feeding on the ambient magical ley lines of the earth itself. The heavier her powerful, dimpled body became, the larger her localized black hole grew, slowly threatening to swallow the covert Vanderbilt financial districts in London and the highly secure Getty artifact vaults. Desperation breeds terrifying compromises. The High Council, comprised of the gaunt skeletal elites who had spent centuries mocking her prominent double chin and broad soft shoulders, formally requested an audience. They sent Lord Arthur Vanderbilt, a deeply ancient, impeccably tailored vampire who controlled the Western Hemisphere's blood banks. He was permitted to cross the threshold of the Kensington estate only because Beatrice temporarily, agonizingly lessened the atmospheric pressure, allowing him to heavily drag his trembling feet into the beautifully ruined grand foyer. Lord Vanderbilt paused at the base of the spectacular fractured marble staircase, his hollow, pale cheeks violently twitching, the sheer radiating heat of the dark matter compounding within Beatrice's heavy fat cells made the grand ballroom feel like the interior of a highly active volcano. He looked up, his terrifyingly sharp eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated awe and deep-seated horror as the queen slowly descended. Beatrice wore no restrictive emerald corsets. She was draped in a magnificent heavy robe of pure spun gold that flowed effortlessly over her monumental, deeply soft curves. Her brutally chopped, luminescent silver hair had grown slightly crackling with dark violet lightning that aggressively framed her beautifully round, flushed face. She moved with the slow, devastating, undeniable majesty of a tectonic plate shifting deep beneath the ocean floor. Every single heavy footstep sent a localized tremor rattling through Vanderbilt's incredibly dense, brittle bones. "Lord Vanderbilt," Beatrice greeted, her heavily resonating voice vibrating directly through the shattered crystal chandeliers above them. "You look profoundly unwell. Perhaps you are severely lacking in substantial nourishment. The hollow aesthetic you so desperately cling to seems incredibly fragile in the presence of genuine, unapologetic mass." Vanderbilt swallowed hard, his fiercely guarded arrogance entirely evaporating. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice shaking violently, "the Directorate officially concedes. The global blood markets are crashing. The underground Vatican heavily encrypted servers are completely panicked by your expanding gravitational anomaly. We humbly request terms of surrender. We will formally recognize you as the absolute sovereign of the Western Empire. We merely ask that you completely release the localized pressure upon our trapped aristocracy and restore the magical equilibrium." Beatrice stopped on the final marble step, her massive, incredibly powerful presence thoroughly dominating the ruined foyer. "You seek a return to the status quo, Vanderbilt. You want me to quietly stabilize the Ashford magic so you can all comfortably return to your pathetic, starved little hierarchies. But the era of the gaunt is permanently dead. I will not shrink my immense power to comfortably accommodate your profound fragility." As she spoke, a sudden, desperate movement caught Vanderbilt's eye from the shadowed ruins of the grand banquet hall. It was Alistair, the heavily bruised, completely humiliated former king, had spent 3 agonizing weeks crawling through the shattered debris of his own conquered estate. He had completely bypassed the magical wards, slowly dragging his painfully crushed body toward the highly secure, heavily guarded royal armory. He clutched a remarkably ancient, deeply cursed weapon, the legendary Hearst dagger, a blade forged from deeply irradiated meteoric iron specifically designed to violently bypass immortal biological defenses. Beatrice, Alistair violently screamed a pathetic, wildly desperate roar of a thoroughly broken predator. He launched himself from the shadows using the very last, incredibly agonizing reserves of his vampiric speed. His target was not her heavily protected heart, but the thick, incredibly soft expanse of her prominent stomach, hoping to violently rupture the highly volatile dark matter matrix, violently compounding within her immense fat cells. Vanderbilt violently recoiled, bracing for the catastrophic apocalyptic explosion that would surely vaporize the entire city of London. The Hearst dagger heavily struck Queen Beatrice's stomach. The deeply cursed, heavily irradiated meteoric iron violently shattered into 1,000 useless, glittering fragments. The absolute second it made contact with her dense, heavily compacted adipose tissue, the blade simply could not possibly penetrate the incredibly thick, biologically perfect armor of her heavy mass. The raw, violent, kinetic energy of Alistair's desperate strike was instantly, completely absorbed by her soft, monumental curves, dissipating harmlessly into the localized gravitational field. Alistair violently collapsed at her bare, heavily dimpled feet, staring blankly at the shattered, useless hilt in his fiercely trembling hand. His absolute final, deeply treacherous gambit had completely, utterly failed. Beatrice looked down at him, her pitch-black eyes entirely devoid of anger, reflecting only a deep, profound pity. "You truly are a remarkably slow learner, Alistair. My heavy weight is not a localized vulnerability. It is the absolute, undeniable foundation of the entire world." The complete, deeply humiliating failure of Alistair's desperate assassination heavily cemented the undeniable reality of the new supernatural order. Lord Vanderbilt violently fell to his heavily trembling knees, completely ignoring the painful, agonizing splintering of his brittle joints against the spectacularly fractured marble floor. He deeply bowed his aristocratic, pale head, formally offering his absolute, unconditional submission to the immensely powerful, unapologetically obese queen. "We are yours to command, Empress." Vanderbilt violently choked out the heavy, suffocating gravity, actively pressing his hollow chest painfully inward. "The Sanguine Directorate will immediately dismantle the old aesthetic laws. We will completely restructure the high society. Whatever you heavily desire, it shall be instantaneously done." Beatrice heavily turned her broad, powerful back upon the deeply pathetic, entirely ruined form of her treacherous former husband. She slowly walked heavily toward the violently shattered grand entrance of the Kensington estate, her massive, heavily dimpled feet leaving localized, fiercely glowing craters in the heavily polished hardwood. The heavy gold-spun robe deeply emphasized her wide, formidable hips and her beautifully prominent, thoroughly soft stomach. She completely embraced the immense, magnificent space she profoundly occupied. "Here are my absolute, heavily binding terms." Beatrice's heavy velvet voice loudly echoed across the beautifully ruined estate, projecting violently outward through the deeply terrified ranks of the supernatural elite violently trapped within her localized gravity. "The cruel, heavily enforced worship of the hollow and the starved is officially permanently abolished. The underground fashion houses, heavily sponsored by the Arnault Syndicate, will absolutely cease producing their pathetic, highly restrictive garments. The aristocratic courts will actively heavily celebrate genuine mass density and profound biological abundance. She paused deeply, inhaling the heavy ozone-scented air, the fiercely churning pitch-black vortex completely covering the skies above London, aggressively responded violently, flashing with massive, deeply violet lightning. The Ashford magic requires a heavily anchored, incredibly massive vessel, Beatrice heavily explained, her dark, pitch-black eyes scanning the heavily crushed, deeply whimpering lords and ladies plastered painfully across the ballroom floor. For 3 agonizing centuries, I actively absorbed the deeply cruel, violently humiliating abuse of this highly toxic court. I heavily restrained my immense absolute power simply to preserve your profoundly fragile egos. That supreme charity firmly ends tonight. She heavily gestured toward the spectacularly shattered obsidian throne, heavily resting in the violently ruined royal chamber. "Alistair," she commanded softly, the heavy vibrating sound of his violently hated name instantly locking his fiercely trembling spine in agonizing absolute paralysis. "You shall permanently remain heavily bound to the base of my deeply fractured throne. You profoundly desired a completely skeletal, deeply elegant aesthetic. You shall heavily starve there, perfectly preserved in your highly hollow, deeply brittle perfection, forced to completely witness the absolute rise of a heavily magnificent, profoundly vast empire." Alistair violently wept deeply, sobbing heavy tears of extremely dark blood that completely ruined his fiercely pale, deeply hollow cheeks. He was violently dragged backward by the unseen, absolutely terrifying crush of her localized gravity, securely pinned permanently against the base of the deeply fractured obsidian stone. He had completely traded the absolute incredibly heavy anchor of the entire supernatural world for a brutally hollow, violently melted mistress who now permanently resembled a fiercely smoking, heavily blistered ruin. Over the course of the next immensely heavy decade, the entire deeply secretive, immortal underground completely heavily transformed. The fiercely wealthy Getty blood vaults and the incredibly powerful Rothschild syndicates heavily restructured their massive, deeply global assets to absolutely accommodate the new, immensely powerful empress. The grand, heavily gilded halls of the European courts rapidly filled with remarkably dense, highly formidable vampires who completely abandoned the deeply pathetic, violently starved aesthetics of the past. Empress Beatrice permanently reigned from her completely ruined, heavily fortified Kensington estate. She did not fiercely rebuild the heavily fractured marble walls or the violently shattered crystal chandeliers. She actively kept the deeply destroyed aesthetic as a heavily powerful, fiercely permanent reminder of the sheer, unadulterated devastation that heavily occurs when a deeply fragile society actively attempts to violently compress a highly massive, profoundly magnificent force of nature. Her incredibly heavy, profoundly soft body continued to slightly slowly expand her prominent double chin and completely broad, heavily powerful shoulders, becoming the absolute heavily worshipped standard of supreme, undeniably divine, immortal power. Her brutally chopped, violently luminescent silver hair heavily grew back fully, completely forming a fiercely thick, aggressively beautiful halo of raw, deeply stable dark matter. The profoundly heavy glutton queen had completely fiercely devoured the ancient, deeply toxic empire. In its absolute, completely shattered place, she heavily, profoundly birthed a fiercely magnificent, deeply dense singularity. The deeply starved, incredibly cruel era of the highly brittle predators was completely violently extinguished. The entire world now heavily, profoundly bowed to the supreme, entirely magnificent weight of the absolute heaviest, deeply powerful sovereign in incredibly recorded immortal history. If you were entirely captivated by Queen Beatrice's deeply magnificent, fiercely heavy revenge and her profoundly absolute, violently incredible ascension to the heavily fractured throne, absolutely hit that like button, deeply smash the subscribe bell to fiercely join our highly growing community of intensely passionate dark fantasy lovers. We heavily drop completely new, fiercely dramatic, deeply romantic and highly twisted supernatural stories every single week. Please heavily share this fiercely incredible video with your friends and actively comment below, would you deeply heavily survive the absolute crushing localized gravity of the fiercely magnificent Empress Beatrice? Let us absolutely know